What are your principal thoughts on the issue of wealth inequality?
In my view, wealth inequality is a scourge on the earth. It's a global phenomenon which represents one of humanity's biggest problems and challenges. Statistically, it's worse in the United States, but most evident and detrimental in developing countries such as Haiti, where you can see the real divide between the rich and the poor. Most have heard the statistics that the richest 1% claims 1/3 of the nation's wealth, where the top 5% claims 60%. The Gini Coefficient is a variable that helps measure wealth distribution when you're looking at economic growth. The United States has a Gini Coefficient of 0.38. It's measured in 2010, which represents the least amount of equitable distribution in the world. And this is not by chance. In the United States, it's the logical and intentional result of various post-New Deal policies and pressures under a capitalist system which was designed to maximize and extract as much wealth as possible and to redistribute this wealth upward.
What type of ramifications does this wealth inequality have on society? And why is there so much concern over it?
Well, citizens of unequal societies end up unhealthy, unhappy, unsafe, in jail, or even at war, fighting for the limited resources that exist. Recent studies show that the most equal societies are the happiest. For example, those of Scandinavia, where there's a much more equitable distribution of wealth. The marginalization of the poor and the dispossessed leads to unrest, ultimately, which can create financial pressures on a country, and ultimately the tearing of a country's social fabric. Ultimately, it can have repercussions on the environment as well, because people survive by any means necessary at the detriment of the environment. This can also lead to the weakening of democracy, as financial institutions with the highest concentration of wealth exert their influence over policies to their favor, and this continues to exacerbate the situation. In extreme cases, it leads people to try to leave the country by any means necessary, and this migration is becoming a big problem around the world, and people are escaping in dangerous, often deadly situations, which then also creates pressure on the receiving societies. Ironically, these results are worse for industry as there are less people with the means to afford to pay for their goods and services. And they have more people on social services which drain away from the infrastructural improvements which they ultimately need to benefit.
How do you think the societal issue could effectively be tackled? And what do you feel will be required in order to substantiate lasting social change?
Well, there needs to be a narrowing of the wealth gap so that all can benefit and be positive contributors to society. This requires a redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor through a fair tax system. We need to have changes in patterns of production and consumption, fair trade and labor policies, including the raising of wages. It requires a development based on improving conditions for everybody in society, particular job creation, perhaps through renewable energy or agricultural revolutions. Ultimately, we need policy changes, which requires political will, and that the ruling elites relinquish some of their power.
Would you suggest an international movement, perhaps headed by the UN, ECOSOC, or do you feel that wealth inequality would best be solved through the national efforts of separate individual countries?
I feel that international and supranational bodies, for example, the UN ECOSOC, can serve as forums to discuss these issues and to coordinate financial and humanitarian support for those afflicted by poverty. But ultimately, individual countries need to change their internal policies, revise their own tax codes, improve their labor standards, etc., in order to effectively change things on the ground and to mitigate the poverty that's being caused and exacerbated as a result of wealth inequality.
What does this wealth inequality say about the development of humans in general? Is it something we should affix responsibility upon ourselves?
I feel that wealth inequality ultimately demonstrates an inherent greed in humans and a disregard for fellow human beings. People often have a Darwinian justification for this, saying it's the survival of the fittest, but it really represents instant gratification for a few at the expense of the majority and of our collective future. So we all must take responsibility to correct this through means that I discussed before at the level of society, but at an individual level, we can be responsible consumers, for example, knowing where your products are made and buying fair trade products. We can also become involved or establish socio-political movements and programs to reverse the destructive policies and behavior, creating an enabling policy environment coupled with grassroots development and ultimately revolution if necessary.